Lost in the immense Pacific Ocean, thousands of kilometers from the nearest inhabited coast, Easter Island is the most isolated piece of land on our planet. Around 1500 years ago, a small group of Polynesians arrived at this rugged place. Cut off from the rest of the world on this minute volcanic rock without any source of drinking water, they somehow managed to develop a unique civilization, boasting impressive monuments. The Moai, these mysterious stone giants dotted all over the island, are lasting legacies of their civilization. The sheer number of them and their size have fired the imagination of many a traveler. Some saw them as the remains of the lost continent of Atlantis. Others believed they were the works of alien powers.
Cerné par l'océan au cœur d'un environnement fragile, aux ressources limitées, cette étonnante civilisation de l'âge de pierre réussit à instaurer un équilibre délicat. Et pendant plus de 1000 ans, elle connut la paix et la prospérité. Mais soudain, vers le milieu du XVIIe siècle, il semble qu'un chaos d'une incroyable violence se soit déchaîné sur l'île. Les hommes s'entretuèrent, les géants de pierre furent brisés et renversés, la société tout entière s'effondra. Les raisons de ce cataclysme sont encore mystérieuses. Le 5 avril 1722, des explorateurs néerlandais mettent un terme à l'isolement de l'île.
On April 5, 1772, Dutch explorers ended the island's isolation. Initial contacts were friendly, but they soon degenerated. A century and a half later, on December 12, 1862, slave traders abducted nearly all the healthy males to sell them in Peru's guano mines. Among the prisoners were all those who held the ancestral knowledge of this people, passed down through oral traditions. The mass deportation proved fatal for 900 of the men. A mere dozen returned to the island. What they didn't know was that they were carrying a mortal virus, chickenpox. By 1877, the population of Easter Island counted no more than 111 inhabitants. A decimated people who have lost even the memory of their mysterious origins. Today, scientists are trying to piece together this memory by reconstructing the extraordinary and dramatic history of the people of Easter Island. Today, Easter Island is no longer isolated, and the exploration of this enigmatic place has entered a new era. The Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Orefici is one of many scientists who have been seduced by Easter Island, which is now owned by Chile. For 10 years, he's been coming here regularly with a team of specialists, anthropologists, botanists, architects, and linguists. The man welcoming them is called Rafael Rapu. He's a member of one of the oldest families on the island. He organized the logistics of all the previous expeditions and has become a good friend of Giuseppe's. Easter Island, Rapa Nui for the Polynesians, is a real paradise for archaeologists. The island, some 20 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide, contains some 25,000 sites, of which only a fifth have been thoroughly excavated. For Giuseppe, the choice of the site is critical. This is Anakina, the only beach on the island. According to legend, it's here that the first Polynesian settlers arrived 1,500 years ago. The aim of the expedition is to excavate the ruins of an ahu, one of these big open-air temples that were at the heart of the social life of the island's tribes. 272 ahu have been discovered all over the island. The Ahu Runga is one of the biggest and most ancient. It has still never been explored. The archaeologists take over the site methodically. Like many of the old constructions, the Ahu Runga has been left abandoned for centuries. It is made up of a gigantic stone platform held up by a supporting wall 50 meters long, sufficiently solid to support the weight of several moai. The remains of the temple have been scattered over a vast area. One of the stones is visibly different from all the others. It is worn and easily broken and must be carefully handled. The familiar shape of a moai appears, or rather, the body of a moai. Its hands can still be made out reasonably well. The stomach is wide and pot-bellied. Giuseppe thinks it can't be very old. The statue's body has been reused as backfill at a later point when the Ahu was being built. Judging by the marks on the stone, the head of this moai was deliberately cut off. For Polynesians, it's this part of the body that contains the soul, the mana. They must have wanted to keep it close by. Giuseppe decides to look for it. Pieces of moai fill the fields, but these have been irreversibly damaged, eroded by wind and rain. Two elements that regularly vent their energies on Easter Island, and which this time forced the search to be suspended. The next day, Clement, the local archaeologist on the team, tells Giuseppe that during the night he spoke to several farmers living nearby, and he has something to show him. A way to thank Giuseppe for the interest being shown in his people and in their mysterious past. "500 meters from the site, a big block of stone is lying in the grass. Giuseppe immediately recognizes the head of a moai. But it's much too heavy to turn over. The real face-to-face will have to wait for when the rest of the team arrive. Carved out of volcanic tuft, the moai is flaky and porous, and handling it demands a lot of careful attention. Raphael's experience is shown to be invaluable. Slowly, delicately, the block of stone is pulled out of the soil. Giuseppe makes an initial evaluation of the condition of this moai head. It wasn't broken during the statue's journey, but adorned the Ahu for a long time. Looking closely, he sees it is weathered on both sides. If it had been broken during transport, the face stuck in the ground would not have shown signs of erosion. Everybody is asking themselves the same question. Is this the head of the moai statue found the day before at the Ahu? According to the measurements made by Giuseppe, it seems this could be the head of the Moai body they discovered. A computer simulation will tell them for certain. A perfect fit, like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. However, there seems to be something missing. But that's also the case for all the other Moai statues on the island. For centuries, the empty eye sockets have intrigued and obsessed scientists. It wasn't until 1978 that Sergio Rapu, a local archaeologist who was restoring the Royal Ahu of Anakina, made a breakthrough. He had collected large pieces of stone and coral found at the site that didn't seem to fit with anything. And yet, some of the fragments of white coral looked as if they joined together. And with this simple gesture, he solved the puzzle. Sergio Rapu gave the Moai their soul back. For the Polynesians, it is the eyes that channel the mana, the mind's energy. After making a series of measurements, archaeologists were able to restore the Ahurunga and its Moai statues to their original appearance. With their backs turned to the ocean, as if the rest of the world didn't exist, the giants watched over the village, guardians of its inhabitants. Under the gaze of these stone idols, the Rapa Nui people lived a peaceful and harmonious existence. On the north end of the island, the Ahu Nau Nau looks familiar. Destroyed during the fall of the Rapa Nui civilization, it was entirely reconstructed by archaeologists in the 1970s. On the slopes of Anakina, a few hundred meters from this magnificent monument, a dig is underway on the even more ancient Ahurunga that should allow an even earlier part of the island's history to be brought to light. The top level of the platform is systematically taken apart, stone by stone. The archaeologists are looking for the smallest clue that might help them understand the ancient Rapa Nui society and just maybe explain the reasons for its brutal decline. Nothing is left to chance. Each stone could hold a piece of crucial information. Suddenly, one of them reveals an unexpected cavity. It contains human remains, but they are damaged. Brian Harrison, the American anthropologist on the team, goes down to inspect the bones more closely. They are obviously recent, probably less than a century old. Their presence confirms that the Ahu were considered sacred sites at that time and that they were used as funerary crypts.
There's a child and a young adult, and the bones are fragmentary. We'll lose some information from that.
The skeletons discovered in the Ahurunga add to an already large collection of bones found on the island. A microscopic examination of the human remains could tell researchers much about the way the Easter Islanders used to live.
General observations on the skeletal material from Easter Island show a population that was very healthy. They've had strong bones. Both males and females were very robust and sturdy in their skeletons. And this is because they had to work very hard in order to survive. They also had very good nutrition from the plants they grew themselves and from the abundant fish around the island. The usual stress indicators we find in skeletal populations are generally absent in the Easter Island samples. And the important characteristic is that the expanse of ocean provided a barrier against introduction of infectious diseases from other populations.
It's a key point. Because of its geographical location, cut off from the rest of the world, Easter Island has had a biologically and genetically closed ecosystem for a long time. Small anomalies have been detected on quite a few of the bones found, a direct consequence of 1,500 years of isolation. For the scientists like Andrea Drusini, an Italian anthropologist from the University of Padua, these tiny traces tell a big story.
Questo femore umano mostra una variazione, un accenno a un terzo trocantere, che è una delle variazioni che si trovano nelle ossa e che ci aiutano a stabilire il grado di consanguineità delle popolazioni e delle tribù che popolavano l'isola. Più alta è la frequenza di queste variazioni e più il cerchio era endogamico, e cioè i rappresentanti di questa tribù si sposavano solamente tra di loro. Attraverso queste informazioni noi possiamo stabilire da un punto di vista geografico la distribuzione delle tribù che popolavano anticamente l'isola di Pasqua.
By cross-referencing these observations with those made by the first ethnologists of the 18th century, a map can be drawn up which shows how the tribes were distributed over the island. 11 separate tribes shared this minute kingdom. Each had its own farmland and access to the sea. It's estimated that at its height, the population of this island of only 165 square kilometers numbered between 10 and 20,000 people. Only a complex social and religious organization could have ensured the management of the limited resources of the territory. Using other Polynesian cultures as a base, it's thought that the islanders obeyed a system of taboos. The king ordered strict quotas on rare products, and a rigid hierarchy guaranteed these were observed within each tribe. A principal religious structure, the Ahu of the chief's family, dominated each of the 11 territories. The more important the tribe, the more moai it had on its Ahu. 900 of these megaliths have been found on Easter Island, and each one is carved with individual features. The moai probably gave an aura of spiritual power to the chiefs and the priests. But what was their role, their function in the Rapa Nui religion? Why were they so different from each other? Other statues, less well known but just as remarkable, can help us answer these questions. They are made of wood, and the Rapa Nui call them moai kava kava. Giuseppe visited a Chilean professor, José Miguel Ramirez, an archaeologist and expert in Rapa Nui culture.
Bueno, en general las figuras de este tipo, igual que los moai de piedra, eran representaciones.
According to him, statuettes of this sort, like the moai, are representations of the spirits of the islanders' ancestors. The Rapa Nui believed that these idols in wood or stone were the physical incarnation of the spirits of the dead. They were kept in people's homes and brought out to take part in festivals or ceremonies. They played a crucial role in their animist culture. More than 1,000 of these statuettes have been found, and each one is unique. Each one is the embodiment of the spirit of a former inhabitant of the island. Thanks to these priceless collections, the Rapa Nui people have emerged from the distant past. The vital force of their ancestors, the mana, which resides in the eyes of the stone moai, also fills the kava kava, which means rib in Rapa Nui. Out of respect for the divine essence which they believed resided in the sacred Tormiro tree, many of the figures follow the twists and turns of the branches from which they are carved. These objects are an insight into the universe of the Rapa Nui. These long carvings with women's heads and eyes of bone or obsidian indicate that they belong to the upper classes. Others, much shorter, designated warrior chiefs. These items were the privilege of aristocrats who carried them during festivals. These two-headed statues evoke the countless gods of the Rapa Nui, their vicissitudes and their different shapes and forms. These chest ornaments adorned with bearded faces at each end were symbols of wisdom and authority, carried by Ariki Mau, the island's king. We can see the intense spirituality of a people in these curious effigies, a people whose survival was closely linked to their place in nature. They also reveal how deeply the immense ocean that surrounded them penetrated into their thoughts, conjuring up marvels and terrors. After 5 weeks of excavating, each stone of the Ahurunga has been studied and noted. The temple's ruins are a jumbled mass, much disturbed by successive reutilization of the stones and centuries of abandonment. Archaeologists have compiled all this information and drawn up a detailed map of the Ahu on which it is possible to retrace its history. The Ahurunga was reconstructed 3 times between the 7th and the 17th century, and then was totally abandoned. The stones of each temple were used as foundations for the next one, and each time the Ahu grew larger. A cavity discovered in a sector matching the period that followed the upheaval of the civilization catches Giuseppe's attention. On one of the walls, a petroglyph, an etching in a rock. A face frozen in time, half covered with moss. A second one is located on the roof, but the space is too tiny to see clearly what it represents. Paper and a thick pencil allow them to make a faithful copy.
Jorge, ¿llegas a trabajar abajo?
Sí, pero no muy cómodo.
For a specialist of Polynesian mythology, the meaning of these geometric artifacts is obvious.
Los ojos, los varios círculos.
These eyes, these concentric circles, are without doubt make-make. It's a symbol seen on several tombs. It represents the god of war. This may be the grave of a warrior dating from the last period, after the destruction of the Moai and the big stones of the Ahu. Make-make. The creator and the god of war had a human face for the Polynesians. The deity is frequently represented in etchings from this epoch. Should we consider it a sign of the main preoccupation of the Rapa Nui during the period that followed the cataclysm? Perhaps. But this technique of using symbols to communicate their vision of the world is one of the most surprising characteristics of the Rapa Nui civilization. They literally covered the island with representations of the many divinities through which they understood the world around them. On the island, there is one place where this form of expression takes on a special dimension. That is the Ana Okek Grotto on Poiki Peninsula. The circumference of Easter Island is riddled with grottos that were formed when the volcanoes were still active. On the sheer faces of these cliffs are many chambers and tunnels hollowed out by streams of lava. At times in the island's past, these grottos were used as temporary shelters. But the Ana Okeke grotto is unusual. It opens the door on a fascinating aspect of Rapa Nui culture. From the many petroglyphs that decorate its walls, some specialists have been able to discern a form of rudimentary writing. Among them are figures with anatomically ambiguous bodies, creatures of fantasy. What do these prehistoric symbols, these Polynesian hieroglyphics, mean? In studying these works, the outline of a structured form of writing may seem nonsensical. And yet the same signs are found over and over again, delicately engraved in continuous lines which cover the famous wooden tablets known as Rongo Rongo. These tablets are one of the biggest mysteries of Easter Island. They date back to a period after the upheaval, and 130 years of research into them by Western specialists have produced more questions than answers. What do these strange characters represent? Sounds? Words? Ideas? With 603 different symbols, the Rongo Rongo tablets are a real nightmare for cryptologists. If we could manage to decipher them, then maybe we could find the key to unlock the entire history of the Rapa Nui people. One of them was given to Bishop Tepano Jausen in 1869. He immediately understood its importance and asked Catholic missionaries to collect any they came across. But the Rapa Nui had forgotten the ancient lore in the tablets and were using them as fuel for their fires. Today, there are only 25 engraved tablets like this. The Santiago staff is unique. It is decorated with 2,320 symbols. In the 1950s, a German ethnologist, Thomas Bartel, transcribed all the inscriptions. By doing this, he identified 120 basic symbols that were modified through a system of prefixes and suffixes. Sources from the 19th century suggested that the tablets were meant to be read by starting on the bottom left and moving from left to right. At the end of each line, the block had to be turned over and continued in the opposite direction. In this way, a scribe never lost his place and never skipped a line. But what do the symbols mean? Generations of linguists have tried in vain to make sense of them. Right up until recently, when Dr. Stephen Fisher, director of the Institute for Polynesian Languages and Literature in Auckland, New Zealand, stunned the linguistic world by proposing a new interpretation, one that some consider to be a major discovery.
For thousands of years, the Polynesians, indeed all the Oceanians, had no writing at all. There was no need for writing throughout all of Oceania. And the first writing that we encounter throughout all of Oceania happens to occur on Easter Island, and that is to be explained by the fact that the Spaniards arrived in 1770 and had the Rapa Nui people sign a deed of annexation. The Rapa Nui people didn't have a clue what writing was about, but they were brilliant enough to interpret that graphic art could be combined to human speech in writing on a flat surface from left to right in lines. So once the Spaniards had left, they took this idea and, borrowing from their petroglyphs as the graphic art, they were able to start writing the same way as the Spaniards did and produce these marvelous Rongo Rongo tablets.
In 1886, the ship USS Mohican arrived on Easter Island to conduct a number of studies for the Smithsonian Institute. In one of them, the scientists showed a photograph of one of Bishop Jousen's tablets to one of the inhabitants. Squinting at the image, he started to chant a ritual incantation that seemed to count gods in groups of 3. The words of this hymn were immediately transcribed into Rapa Nui dialect.
I always kept this in mind, and years later I was studying the Santiago staff. And on the Santiago staff, I noticed something interesting. I noticed that the Santiago staff always had units of 3 hieroglyphs together. One hieroglyph, which I will call A, with a phallus on it, followed by a second, B, without a phallus, followed by a third, C, without a phallus. The next one then, in the series of some 2,000 hieroglyphs on this staff, always followed in this sequence A, phallus, B, C, A, phallus, B, C. That gave me a triad structure, in other words, a structure of 3 hieroglyphs. Suddenly it dawned on me, wait, this is identical to the procreation chant sung by the Rapa Nui in 1886. I linked the 2 together, and this gave me the key to reading Rongorongo. For example, the sign for a bird will appear with a phallus, followed by the sign for a fish and the sign for a sun. We read this as, the bird is mating with the fish, and there issued forth from this mating the sun. And it's in Old Rapa Nui, we would read this as, Te manu mau ki aikiroto ki te ika kapute ra'a. We have many examples of that happening. The plant mates with another plant, and that creates a flower. A fish mates with another fish, and that creates a type of seabird. So on and so forth. And this would then give us what are known as procreations. These procreations explain the universe of the Rapa Nui people.
Sung during religious ceremonies, the words of the Rongorongo explained the cosmos and the community and reminded the Rapa Nui of their place in the natural order of things. For more than 1,000 years, the Rapa Nui had prospered in perfect harmony with nature. The king pronounced the taboos, the priests and the culture of the ancestors supported his reign. The whole social structure went to maintaining a delicate balance with the few resources on the island. Their civilization flourished. And then, suddenly, something happened. Towards the end of the 18th century, the European explorers were shocked by what they found. The journal of Captain Cook mentions scenes of desolation. Hundreds of moai had been toppled from the Ahu and lay broken on the ground. What happened? An earthquake? A tidal wave? Scientists found no trace of either phenomenon. There was only one other explanation. The Rapa Nui had rampaged through their own temples. But why? What could have pushed the inhabitants of the island to destroy what they had taken a millennium to build? The terrible answer is maybe to be found here. Rano Raraku volcano, the birthplace of the Moai. It is without a single doubt the grandest, most impressive place on the island. The Rapa Nui had turned Rano Raraku into a vast quarry. All the Moai started their existence here, hewn from the same rock. But this incredible site seems to have been abruptly abandoned. Looked at today, it appears to be suspended in time, as if the workers had just suddenly dropped their tools and left. Around the top of the volcano, the shapes of hundreds of statues can be discovered, emerging from the rock. The different phases of sculpture can be seen. From their outlines taking shape, up to the chipping away of whole sections. More than 300 incomplete moai are still waiting to be freed from the earth. For some, it seems like only a few heavy blows are all it would take to send them sliding down the flanks of the volcano. Research into the island has shown the Moai cult lasted nearly 1,000 years between the 7th and 17th centuries. This is one of the oldest on the island. Afterwards, the style of the Moai changed markedly over several periods, but one thing stayed the same: a desire to make them all giants. As Thor Heyerdahl showed in 1975, almost all the Moai present in the quarry belonged to the last period of Rapa Nui civilization. Their full size is still hidden under the earth, probably made deeper by mudslides caused by the rain. The most colossal of all of them, El Gigante, is nearly 22 meters tall and weighs around 160 tons. At the time the quarry was abandoned, the same time as the social upheaval, the Rapa Nui had embarked on a frenetic round of activity to make a stupendous number of gigantic Moai. Why were they working so desperately? What were they pleading for from their ancestors? Scientists have asked these questions 1,000,000 times and built observation on observation. Centuries of living in such a small environment must have left clues to an answer. For 10 years, archaeologists Christopher Stevenson and Sonia Hawa have been conducting joint research into the agricultural techniques of the ancient population of the island. Despite its 250 days of rain per year, Easter Island has no land ideal for farming. The wind, which constantly whips across the island, accelerates evaporation, and the porous volcanic ground soaks up the water immediately.
Look, there it is.
What the two scientists are looking for are remnants of human activity, like this umu, a traditional Polynesian oven made up of 5 stones.
That's a good site. Let's mark it.
The exact position of the primitive kitchen is worked out by GPS and carefully noted down. Its approximate age will be determined later in a lab by testing samples of obsidian found at the site. By studying dates and locations, Dr. Stevenson is trying to find the way in which the Rapa Nui changed their approach to farming. He's especially interested in the time before the civilization's collapse. The map from their work shows a significant rise in the amount of land used for farming in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries.
I think the agricultural system on Easter Island was maintained for a very long period of time. It was very successful. I think slowly, over decades, the level of production decreased slightly, a little more each year. This motivated the chiefs to try and intensify even further by bringing more land into production and to increasing the input, the energy that the people actually had to do to keep production high. But eventually, a threshold was reached where the people said, we're not going to support you anymore. And that's when the change happened.
And so, just a short while before the dramatic events of the 17th century, harvests diminished. Feeding not only their families but also the ruling class and the priests demanded too much of the farmers. But was the discontent of the peasants enough to trigger a social upheaval of this scale? And how could the output from farming have diminished when more and more land was being used? Did something upset the natural balance of the island? Modern techniques have brought to light some clues that had been previously overlooked. Archaeologists poking around inside the prehistoric kitchens uncovered by the digs have taken minuscule amounts of ash. These samples are then sent to the Laboratory of Prehistoric Ethnology in Paris, where two archaeological specialists on Oceania, Catherine and Michel Orliac, have obtained startling results concerning the evolution of Easter Island's ecology by examining the burnt powder. They use sophisticated equipment like this scanning electron microscope to examine the molecular structure of the samples and identify the carbonized residue that up until now has given away few secrets. Each species of plant has a genetic pattern that is just as distinctive as a fingerprint.
Donc là, je suis sûre, mes ponctuations sont bien ornées. Donc j'ai bien affaire à un petit Sophorato Romero.
This process also allows the species to be identified by comparing its genetic signature with those already recorded. Over the past 5 years, using the analyses of 33,000 ash samples, the Orliacs have identified 13 species of tree which used to grow on Easter Island and which today have completely disappeared. Covered with lush vegetation dominated by tall palm trees, Easter Island must have looked a lot like this valley in central Chile. A valuable source of material for tool making, this forest produced shade, captured water, and provided a windbreak which would have naturally protected fields of crops. Dating of the ash sample shows that the Rapa Nui used wood to cook their food up to 1640. After that, significantly, there is no more wood detected. Why? Simply because there were probably no more trees left to burn. But how could such a sudden deforestation happen?
L'explication la plus communément admise est celle de la destruction des arbres et des arbustes par l'homme. Mais ça devient, dans ce court laps de temps, en quelques décennies, ça devient très difficile à admettre, sauf si l'on croit que les gens ont été pris d'une folie destructrice. Bon, mais ça, c'est difficile à admettre. Nous pensons plutôt que le climat est responsable de ce genre d'accident, car là, la brièveté du phénomène implique un accident, à notre avis. Et dans le climat, ce qui peut produire la disparition, ce qui peut provoquer la disparition des arbres et des arbustes, c'est la sécheresse. Et c'est pour ça que nous pensons qu'une sécheresse qui a duré sans doute plusieurs années fait disparaître les arbres et les arbustes de l'île de Pâques.
Victims of a long drought, the Rapa Nui could have only helplessly watched their forests thin out, then disappear, making their soil less and less fertile. The fields would have dried up, and the harvests would have shrunk despite efforts by farmers. As the situation became worse, the Rapa Nui must have thought about escaping. But there was no more wood for the construction of boats. Their island had become a prison. The chiefs and priests demanded that more moai be built, bigger and bigger ones, to appease their angry gods. And what they pleaded their ancestors for was water. But the gods remained deaf. Betrayed by their ancestors they had worshipped for so long, the Rapa Nui began to doubt their faith and their chiefs. Social cohesion collapsed. The fragile balance that had lasted 13 centuries broke apart. Violence raged on the island. The rivalries between the tribes exploded. The Ahu were looted, the Moai were toppled and broken. The only thing that mattered was the struggle for survival. Trapped on their island, the Rapa Nui were confronted with their own extinction. After the bloody revolution, the surviving Rapa Nui embarked on a period of reconstruction. Determined to rebuild a working society needed for their survival, they created a new religion, one radically different from the old one. Rock carvings tell the story of this change. A new god appeared in the Rapa Nui heavens, a bizarre creature with a human body and a bird's head. Tangata Manu, the Birdman. Over several decades, the cult of the Birdman, a god unknown in the rest of Oceania, took on obsessional proportions. Images of birds appeared everywhere, on hundreds of carved rocks, even on the skulls of the dead. The Rapa Nui seem to have been fascinated by the migrating birds that visited the island in spring. They were, after all, the only living things that were able to cross the boundless waters to make it to their island and then leave. The birds became a powerful metaphor for an exile that had become unbearable. A ceremonial site was dedicated to this new cult. Ranau Kau, a volcano in the southwest of the island. It was here that the tribes gathered to form a new social order that would guarantee the survival of future generations. Close to the crater, a ceremonial complex called Orongo was built. Its stone huts were used by priests and participants in the annual festivals of the Birdman. Each year, a strange competition led to the selection of a new Birdman who became the island's king. Given extraordinary powers for a year, the Birdman spent his time proclaiming laws that would ensure harmony and prosperity for the following months. The Rapa Nui civilization had managed to establish a new harmony and seemed on the point of growing once more. But right at this time, the outside world arrived to dash all hopes of a renaissance. The Rapa Nui civilization was practically wiped out by the advent of the Westerners, who decimated the people and stripped them of the one thing they had left, the memory of their glorious past. Today, the Rapa Nui are rediscovering their past. Thanks to the work of archaeologists, they are starting to piece together their collective memory, and with it, their pride of belonging to a people who lived an incredible adventure on this minuscule piece of land. But Easter Island, this lost atoll in the middle of the ocean, still holds on to many mysteries. For a long time to come, it will be a magnet for man's thirst for knowledge. Because it is, more than anywhere else, the stuff that dreams are made of.